Welcome back, everyone, and today we're going to be looking at some more dimensions of values as we take a look at how values differ across cultures. What do you value? Do you value hard work? Do you value family? Do you value God? What is your priority? Well, a person's priority is going to be really their values. It stems from their values. So we're going to look and see how values can differ across cultures. We're also going to be taking a look at emotions and how emotions impact the worker. And also, finally, we're going to be looking at attribution. Attribution is how we make reason out of people's behavior. When people perform good, do you attribute that to the people or to the environment? So let's take a look today at some of these concepts as we go in a little bit deeper to the psychology of the employee, as we look at emotions, as we look at cultural values, and as we look at attributions. Okay, everyone, welcome back, and we're going to continue on today in Chapter 4, Individual Values, Perceptions, and Reactions. Now, you probably already know, and it goes without saying, that not everyone has the same values. They differ among individuals, even in our culture, but there are some profound differences in values that reach across the world, and your book talks about this. And there are two major dimensions that they discuss in the textbook that you're going to find as well in the business world. First of all, you have the traditional versus secular rational values. And this is really the extent to which people value religion over secularism. There are some regions in the world that are very religious, for the Middle East, for instance, and they will stop work 5 times a day to pray. They will have different customs and so forth that follow along their religion. And then there are some that are not religious at all. They have secular values and so forth. Not that they don't act right or whatever, but depending on the region, you'll have very religious areas, and then you'll have non-religious areas. For instance, even here in America, let's take Chick-fil-A. Chick-fil-A is a conservative Christian company. They don't open on Sunday because they value the Sabbath. So that would give you an example of that. And then there's some that see church and all of that as rivals. So they're going to open up and have sales during Sunday and try to get you to come and shop in their places of business and so forth. So one of the dimensions that you'll find in the world are the traditional versus secular rational values. And then you have survival versus self-expression values. And this, as you can see, reflects the contrast between societies that emphasize economic and physical security and those that emphasize subjective well-being, self-expression, and quality of life. Now, in Central America, for instance, they value being with the family. The Mediterranean, many regions in the Mediterranean are like that. They don't have an 8-hour workday, 5 days a week. Their work schedules are very restricted because they want to spend more time with their families and enjoying their families. They're not after so much the money or wealth as they are being able to just enjoy the families that they have and so forth. And here in America, we value work. In fact, we will sacrifice quality of life and well-being just so that we can keep climbing the ladder. But that's not always the case in different cultures. And this is just visual depiction of how values differ around the world, and based on the way that this map is lined out. You have secular rational values up in the upper left hand, Russia, Moldova, the European, Eastern European type of countries, and then all the way at the bottom, self-expression values, which is again in Central America, Latin America, and so forth. So these are just the different regions, and they'll give you an idea about how they place different values based on the region that they're in. Now let's talk about emotions. Emotions are something, and again, we call emotions affect, and affect is the the feeling part of an individual, and they vary. When it comes to emotions, you can have intense short-term reactions, and a lot of times that's how people respond. In fact, the Bible tells us to not be that way. Don't be impulsive. Don't be irrational. Don't just live by your emotions, but think through your attitudes and your behaviors and so forth. But that's a challenge for many people. And then our emotions are directed usually at something or someone. When we've had a bad experience with something, we're going to have an emotional response to it. Someone does something to us, we're going to have an emotional response to it, and so forth. Now, we also have what's called moods. Now, moods are short-term emotional states that are not directed toward anything in particular. She woke up in a bad mood today, or he's really in a good mood today. These are emotional states that really aren't precipitated or directed by any one particular thing in a person's experience, but they are experienced through affect, through a person's emotions. And then you have affectivity, and that's the tendency to experience a particular mood or to react to things with certain emotions. So affectivity is kind of like the blanket that covers all of it. Now you have the role of emotions and behavior. Positive affectivity, you're usually a person who is upbeat and optimistic. You have an overall sense of well-being. You see things in a positive light. I knew a person who was just bubbly. That's the way that we described her. She was just bubbly. Every time we saw her, it didn't make a difference what time it was. It could be in the morning when most people are grouchy and trying to get awake and get into the workday. She came to work like that, and so she was just always upbeat and optimistic. You have negative affectivity, and they're downbeat and pessimistic. They see things in a negative way, seemingly to be in a bad mood all the time, and you would come to them, and they can bring you down very quickly. You can be in a good mood and ask them, "How are you doing today?" And, "Oh, I'm just in a bad position," or "I'm upset," or I knew one person I would ask, "How are you doing today?" "I'm just waiting to die." Wow, what a horrible disposition for a person. But these are people who see things negatively in all of it. The glass is always half empty. There's always the cloud without a silver lining. So those are the different types of affectivity that people experience, not only just in the workplace, but they're just like that in general. Now, perception. Perception is it's a phenomenon. It is a state that has undergone a lot of research, just like personality. It's a construct, but perception is a set of processes by which an individual becomes aware of and interprets information about the environment. It's the way that you see things. You can have two people experience the same event but draw two different conclusions from it. And that's based on their perception of that event. And there are a lot of things that go in to forming your own personal perception, your own values, attitudes, the way you were growing up, all different types of things can affect your perception. But perception is how you represent the world. Now, you have basic perceptual processes. You have selective perception, and that's screening out information that we are uncomfortable with or that contradicts our beliefs. For instance, if it's something that you don't believe in, you're just going to screen them out. You're going to ignore them, in other words. And that's really what selective perception is. You're ignoring. And the thing about perception and base selective perception is that if we let our biases and our predispositions and suppositions invade our perception process, then we are limiting ourselves to just really a one-dimensional existence. So selective perception is screening out things that are uncomfortable or that contradicts your beliefs and so forth. Now, stereotyping is the categorization or labeling people on the basis of a single attribute, and women can't drive, or men are clumsy. You're stereotyping people. You're labeling the whole bunch based on maybe a single attribute. Now, there are different perception errors that occur, and this is important for you to understand, especially when you become a manager, to try to alleviate or at least to recognize how you can form an opinion about someone, and it may not be accurate. So here's some of the perception errors that we engage in. Categorization, and that's the tendency to put things into groups and then exaggerate the similarities within and the differences among the groups. For instance, men are better engineers than women. Well, you've taken male engineers and you've exaggerated the similarities based on their maleness, and you've excluded all of the qualified women out there who could be engineers. The halo effect, forming a general impression of something or someone based on a single characteristic. Usually when you meet someone or you start to form first impressions, there may be something you like about that person, and if there's a chemistry there, or if there's something that they do or some way that they look that you like, they will, in everything, you will give them high marks for. So that's just exaggerating the good or the positive characteristics of a person. The contrast effect, and that's evaluating someone by comparing them with recently encountered people. Well, you're not as good as Joe. Joe had this going on and that going on, and Joe was just a great person. You might have given Joe the halo effect. And then you try to evaluate someone else, and you're basing your evaluation on that person based on Joe and the halo effect that surrounded Joe, and it's going to be very hard for that person to stack up. Projection, seeing one's own characteristics in others, and you might have heard before, I see a lot of so-and-so in you, and so forth. So that's seeing one's own characteristics in others, and I've done that. I've seen people who I've recognized as being similar to me as I was moving up in business and so forth. So I kind of gravitated towards those people. So you can see characteristics of others or yourself in others. First impression bias, and that's the inability to let go of first impressions, particularly negative ones. And I used to interview when I was the dean of adult education for another college. I've interviewed for different jobs, and if the person came in, I didn't care how qualified they were. If they didn't look professional, I wouldn't give them the time of day. I never will forget, I had one guy interviewing, and he was qualified, but he liked to drop names. Oh yeah, I know the president, and I know so-and-so, and my family plays golf with so-and-so. They gave me a negative impression of that person right off the bat because he's name dropping. So first impressions are very important. So always put your best foot forward whenever you're doing an interview or something like that, because you never know how you're going to come across to other people. Now, attribution is the way that we explain our behavior and others' behaviors and accomplishments. We have to ask ourselves, are they due to the individual because of internal factors such as effort and ability, or are they due to the environment because of external factors such as luck, resources, and other people and so forth? So you may say, well, so-and-so got 100 on that test. Oh, that's because the teacher was easy. Or that's because the teacher likes that person. So you're not attributing that grade to the person. You're attributing that grade to other people's interventions and all of that. So perception and attribution is very important. What do you attribute people's behavior and your own to? Now, there's three things that you have to look at when you're making attributions. And the first is consistency. Has the person regularly behaved this way or experienced this outcome in the past? If the person has consistently gotten F's in a class, It could very well be that this A that they got was by the help of the professor, because it's inconsistent with what the person normally does. Distinctiveness. Does the person act the same way or receive similar outcomes in different types of situations? That means if they have a F in English and in Greek and in math, then if they get an A in Bible, which is the class that you're in with them, there's a distinctiveness there. Something has happened. And then consensus. Would others behave similarly in the same situation or receive the same outcome? So if everybody else would not have gotten an A because they had better grades in the past, then there wouldn't have been a consensus. So you could attribute that A to that professor or the environment more than you would attribute it to the person. Now there's perception and attribution as we continue, and that's self-handicapping. People create obstacles for themselves that make success less likely, and these obstacles provide external explanations for failure, thereby preserving one's sense of self-competence. So people can create for themselves obstacles. I know when I was in the military, I used to have to run 1.5 miles. Every 6 months we had to run 1.5 miles, and I hated running. And I would tell myself right from the very beginning, you're not going to be able to do this today. You don't feel good, or you're tired, or it's too hot outside, or whatever. And we also call this kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So sure enough, I created obstacles that made me being able to run that distance a whole lot more difficult than it would have been had I been positive. I'm going to get through this real quick. I can do this. I've been training and all of that. So, and obstacles also provide external explanation for failure. And it preserves one's sense of self-confidence. It was too hot, that's why I failed. It's not because of me, it's because of the weather outside. And it's the weather that we can blame. But I've done everything I need to do. So these are some of the obstacles, these are some of the ways that we make attributions for not only other people's behavior, but our own. And it's important that we realize that, because when we are expected to perform for ourselves, we have to take ownership of that. And we have to know that what we do is on our own. It's kind of like locus of control. I think I've talked about that. I don't know if it's in this class or other classes, but there are people who believe that they are guided and directed by the environment, that nothing is really in their control. So everything that happens, it happens because of something else, not them. And that's what they blame their failures on. It was always someone else or something else. But a person with an internal locus of control, they're masters of their own destiny. They know that it's no one else but them who's responsible for their behaviors, who are responsible and the ultimate ones who will either succeed or fail. It's not the environment. They can overcome the environment. They can do things that will circumvent the environment to be able to reach their goals and so forth. And these are the ones that have a higher level of performance. They have a higher level of confidence. Their attributions are to themselves and not everybody else. And normally they will attribute things to the people that they work around instead of the environment. These are the ones who don't like to hear excuses. They're the ones who want to see things done. Now, when it comes to ministry, you may have people today that are working under you, or they may be serving in different areas. How do you attribute their performance? Do you look at the person and just inside say, well, she's the type of person who is going to perform. So doing great in ministry is no surprise. Or are you the type that automatically, well, it was because of this that the person was successful and so forth? We have to be very careful, because a lot of times we can make some of these what we call fundamental attribution errors, and really misjudge the individuals. And that's doing them a disservice, and it's doing you a disservice. So as Christians, we need to make sure that we are honestly looking at people the way that they are instead of what we feel they should be, and so forth. Well, everyone, that's all I have for today, and we will continue on tomorrow and finish out this chapter. But until then, God bless you and have a good day. Well, today we looked at values, we took a look at emotions, and we looked at attributions. Now let me ask you, how many times have you made fundamental attribution errors? How many times have you been guilty of some of the things that we saw today, such as the halo effect and contrasting and so forth? You know, it's very easy for us to do that because we're creatures of habit and we're creatures who are experiential. And we see one thing and we think that's how it is, when in fact it may not be. You know, it's very important for us to be able to gauge people wholly instead of just certain attributes that stand out in our minds and in our perceptions and so forth. Well, that's all we have for today, and I will see you guys tomorrow. God bless you and have a good day.